On October 18, 1917, a small steamship called the Macao, about 3,500 tons, was sailing toward Le Havre, France, with a cargo of coffee and cocoa beans. Right about here, just west of the Bay of Biscay, between the coasts of France and Spain, the German submarine U-93, commanded by Helmut Gerlach, spotted the ship and fired a torpedo. No casualties were officially reported. There may have been some, but I just can't verify it. But this sinking was to have pretty significant repercussions. Macao was a Brazilian ship sailing from Rio de Janeiro. Originally built in Germany, she was requisitioned by the Brazilian government earlier in World War I. This incident in October 1917 was just the latest in a string of provocations at sea by Germany against Brazil, including several other sinkings that did claim Brazilian lives. You could say that the downing of the Macao was the straw that broke the camel's back. On October 26, 1917, Venceslau Braz, the president of Brazil, signed a declaration of war against Germany and the other Central Powers. This made Brazil the first, and in fact the only, country in Latin America to enter World War I in a formal way. You might think this is mostly what it was, a formality. No Brazilian troops went to fight in the trenches of France or anywhere else. No German ships were sunk by Brazilians. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, didn't stay up at night worrying about Brazil. If he even knew who Venceslau Braz was, there's no evidence he considered him a particularly dangerous enemy. But Brazil's entry into the First World War was quite important in its own history. This was the beginning of a process which would, over the next 30 years, truly begin the transition of Brazil from an agrarian Latin American country dominated by a plantation economy that was a hangover from its colonial days into a modern industrialized nation and a significant player on the world stage. Between 1914 and 1945, Brazil went from an illiberal republic dominated by oligarchs to a dictatorship that in some ways resembled those of its enemies in World War II to an actual functioning democracy, however fragile that democracy would prove to be later in the 20th century. This story is vitally important to understanding the history of Latin America and the Western Hemisphere in the 20th century. Not a lot of people outside of Brazil know a lot about Brazilian history, especially if you're from an English-speaking country. I doubt that you would have learned much about Brazil in your history or social studies classes. In this video, we're going to fill in that gap in many people's knowledge and hopefully come to understand why this history matters. This is the story of Brazil in and between the two world wars. Hi, I'm Sean Munger. I'm a historian. I have a PhD in American history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing deep dive, context-heavy videos on various historical subjects. The basic concept of this video is similar to one I did recently on the history of Mexico in World War II. But this video is very different from that one, because of course the story it tells is quite different. Brazil's history is really unlike that of any other country in Latin America. It's a highly unique case, as I think you'll see. There is one similarity with Mexico, though. When the subject of Brazil's participation in the world wars comes up, which is rare, far and away the most popular facts that come up relate to Brazil's military expeditionary force, popularly known as the Smoking Cobras, which did deploy to the European theater and saw action in Italy in the later stages of World War II. That this is the most popular fact about Brazil's role in either of the world wars is borne out by what comes up if you search for Brazil and World Wars on YouTube, and it brings up a lot of short videos about the Smoking Cobras without a lot of context or political or social background. And a disturbing amount of those videos are the kind of AI-generated slop that's poisoning the subject of history on YouTube. This is unfortunately similar to the situation of Mexico, where the most popular fact about Mexico in World War II, it did not take part at all in the First War, relates to the 201st Fighter Squadron that briefly took part in air combat in the Pacific. There's a lot of AI slop on YouTube about that too. But basically beyond this, the similarities end. I'm going to be talking about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force and the Smoking Cobras, but not until almost the end of the video, chapter 8. And even then, it's only a very small part of Brazil's experiences in the two world wars. The much more important story involves Brazil's development as a nation. The military and political developments between 1914 and 1945 saw Brazil's emergence as a modern country, with a fragile democracy that was often under threat or totally obscured by dictatorship, both during that period and after it. That's the major story I want to tell here. This story did not begin with Brazil's declaration of war on Germany in October 1917. There's a lot of context leading up to that, which I'll get to in time. The country had been moving in fits and starts toward war for some time. Germany's policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which is what brought the United States into World War I in April 1917, pissed off most neutral countries at that time. Brazil was in the line of fire, though, because it was an important trading partner, both of the United States and formerly of Germany. Brazil was being nudged by the United States to join the war. That effort, which involved, among other things, a visit by 4 U.S. Navy ships to Rio de Janeiro in June 1917, is actually the basis of a personal family connection I have to this historical subject. My great-grandfather was on one of those American ships, on that American mission to Brazil. I'll talk a little bit more about that in Chapter 3. It's noteworthy that the sinking of the Macau, and in fact all the sinkings of Brazilian ships by German subs, occurred in European waters. Submarines were pretty primitive in the First World War, and although Germany had the most advanced ones, they had only a handful that were even capable of the range needed to operate in Brazilian waters. By declaring war, Brazil was expressly projecting itself politically into a world conflict, the center of gravity of which was largely in Europe. Because there was no possibility of sending Brazil's army to Europe to fight in the trenches, I'll talk more about that issue later, the story of World War I for Brazil is almost exclusively a story about ships and naval operations. Brazil entered the conflict late, barely more than a year before it was over, and it had to work in close contact with the other allies, particularly the British. Brazil had a navy in 1917. There had been, earlier in the century, a brief naval arms race between Brazil and what it thought were its most likely adversaries, Chile and Argentina, which resulted in what historians have called the South American dreadnought race. With logistical support of the British Royal Navy, Brazil formed a task force known as the DNOG, an acronym formed from its name in Portuguese, under the command of Rear Admiral Pedro Max Fernando de Frontin. The task force flew the Brazilian flag, but it was largely supported by the Western Allies. Brazil didn't have its own coal to support the DNOG. It had to rely on the British for repairs and spare parts, and even many of the Brazilian Navy's personnel were foreign trained. The British Admiralty saw the DNOG as a useful tool to patrol the coast of West Africa, where Britain and France both had significant colonial holdings. Brazil's forces were good for this because of geography. While it was by no means a short hop across the Atlantic from West Africa to the northeastern coast of Brazil, having an Allied power send ships from there relieved the British of having to do it. They were busy blockading Germany's coast. Still, Brazil was pretty late actually getting into World War I. Its ships arrived off the coast of Sierra Leone, a British colony, on August 8, 1918. That was exactly the day on which the Western Allies began an offensive called the 100 Days Offensive that would ultimately lead to the collapse of German forces on the Western Front and the end of the war. The mission of the DNOG was to patrol a triangle of ocean between Dakar, Cape Verde, and Gibraltar, which was thought to be thick with mines and German U-boats, and ensure the safe passage of Allied convoys through this area. It turned out to be pretty uneventful. A Brazilian tender, the Belmonte, reported that a U-boat fired a torpedo at it on the night of August 25, 1918, and the destroyer Rio Grande do Norte went after it, but this attack was never confirmed by German records, so it's unclear whether it was real or a false alarm. Brazil's true enemy in World War I was not so much German soldiers or U-boats, but microorganisms, the dreaded Spanish influenza, which killed far more Brazilian citizens in the war than enemy fire did. I'll pick up that story in Chapter 3. Before we get to that, there's a great deal of context that we need to get through, both pertaining to the earlier history of Brazil and also its experience in World War I before the formal declaration of war. There are a couple of brief housekeeping matters we should take care of. The major sources I used to research and create this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the video description. I don't speak or read Portuguese, so they are in English. While I am aware that probably the best scholarship on these topics is done in Brazil by Portuguese-speaking historians, I was surprised by the quality of sources that are available in English, particularly the work of Frank McCann, who spent much of his career studying Brazil in this era. Professor McCann unfortunately passed away in 2021. A note about languages. As I said a moment ago, I don't speak Portuguese. I have made a good faith effort to learn the pronunciations of the numerous Brazilian names and Portuguese words that appear in this story. And by good faith effort, I don't mean just clicking the little speaker icon on Google Translate. I consulted actual Portuguese-speaking human beings to try to get this as right as I can make it. So shout out to my Brazilian friends, especially on Instagram. But I guarantee, despite that preparation, I'll fall short much of the time. So, for the pronunciation police who inevitably come after me when I make one of these videos, just calm down, relax, have an Antarctica or two, that's a beer by the way, and try not to be so uptight. If you just can't take it, well, vá assistir vídeos de gatinhos. I don't know what else to say. Another issue. This video involves the World War II era, and whenever I do a video that involves that, there are images, particularly symbols of the Nazi Party or Hitler himself, that I have to redact. I have to do this in order to not have this video demonetized under YouTube's rules. Whenever I do this, someone often pops up in the comments going, "Why did you blur the image of Hitler? How dare you?" Let me make clear again that this is not my choice. YouTube's rules require it, but those are the rules. There is a slightly different version of this video in the members section on my channel. That version is ad-free and also has some additional material that doesn't appear in the free channel version. And also it does not have those redactions. So if you want more, join the members section. I'd love to have you. The other day, while I was deep into the political recesses of the Getúlio Vargas regime, an email notification came across my screen. It was for a scary-looking message purporting to be from a law firm called Cravath, Swain & Moore, LLP, which is a real law firm, started in New York in 1819. Anyway, it was warning me that I had used a song called Someone You Loved by Louis Capaldi in a video on my Facebook page, and I better take it down or I'll end up in court or with my knees broken or something like that. The email was fake, of course, and did not come from that law firm. I don't even know who Louis Capaldi is. Actually, didn't he used to play Doctor Who a few years back? But anyway, the email was obviously a crude phishing attempt, possibly by the Daleks. At the bottom it said, made and sent with mail merge, which means it's a bulk email and also means the scammers have a long list of email addresses they send this scam to. Where do they get them? They get them from companies called data brokers. These companies are legal, but they often sell your information to a lot of shady operators, including those who run phishing and other internet scams, like the one they obviously were hoping I would fall for. Data brokers are legally required to remove your information if you ask them, but they make it really hard to figure out how to do that. I've been working with Aura recently, the sponsor of this video. Aura is an all-in-one digital security service. They take care of the hard parts of digital security by making it easy to request removal of your information from data broker sites. I don't know how to do that on my own, but thanks to them, I don't have to know because their services do the heavy lifting for you. Aura has a lot of other great features. They'll alert you if your personal info winds up on the dark web. They give you real-time fraud alerts on your credit and bank accounts. They monitor your information 24/7 to help prevent identity theft. They've got a secure VPN, antivirus software, a password manager, an extension for Google Chrome, and all kinds of stuff that'll help you keep your private information private. If your information does get stolen and you suffer losses, Aura has up to $5 million in identity theft insurance protection. They have fraud experts available around the clock, at least in the US. I continue to be impressed by Aura. You can try them for free for 14 days by going to a special link for my viewers, aura.com/SeanMunger. During those 2 weeks, you'll see where your data is being exposed and sold, and you can start doing something about it. Aura can help get your data out of the clutches of the Daleks who sent me that email, and you don't even need Doctor Who. So, thanks to Aura for sponsoring the video. Now, let's get on with Brazil in the World Wars. The first thing you have to understand is that Brazil is quite a different animal than any other country in Latin America. By the time Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence in September 1822, and indeed for about a century before, Brazil had already consolidated most of the territory and boundaries that it has down to the present day. Though vast amounts of that territory, particularly in the Amazon region, were unknown to Europeans and occupied principally by indigenous people. Pedro was the son and heir of the King of Portugal, Dom João VI. In 1807, when Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal, the Portuguese royal family transferred their entire court to Brazil, their largest colony, as sort of a government in exile. Indeed, Napoleon's ultimately unsuccessful conquest of the Iberian Peninsula was indirectly the spark for the independence of Spain's colonies in the Americas, and also on a longer fuse for the independence of Brazil from Portugal. The story of Brazil's independence, which is quite interesting, is beyond our scope here. Suffice it to say, the Portuguese ruling family decided to go back to Portugal in 1822. After the Napoleonic Wars were over, and after a revolution to establish a constitutional monarchy broke out in Portugal, Dom Pedro stayed and became the first emperor of Brazil. Brazil's identity as a Portuguese colony and its Portuguese language and unique culture, which fused elements of Portuguese society with indigenous peoples and many enslaved people from Africa, is a large part of why Brazil held together as a cohesive unit during its tumultuous colonial history and in the period of its early independence. The Spanish-speaking former colonies in the Americas, upon achieving independence, fractured into numerous countries: Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and so forth. Brazil didn't fracture, though, as we'll see in the main period of our story, it did have very significant internal rivalries between regions, especially São Paulo and Minas Gerais. If you wonder why Brazil was settled by the Portuguese and thus adopted the Portuguese language in the first place, the short answer is the Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494. I'm not going to get into that, but be careful if you look for videos about it, because there's a lot of worthless and terrible AI slop about it here on YouTube. Anyway, moving on. As an independent country, an empire, as its rulers called it, Brazil's economy was heavily dominated by coffee. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, political and economic power in Brazil was concentrated in the coffee plantations and those who owned them. That was not Brazil's only crop, as sugar was important also, but the two industries behaved similarly. Long after it ceased to be a colony, Brazil continued to be an essentially colonial-style economy, growing cash crops, coffee, and sugar with slave labor. The United States and Germany were the largest buyers of Brazil's coffee in the late 19th century. Slavery was absolutely key to Brazil's economy. The labor of millions of Africans and African-descended people built the enormous wealth of Brazil's coffee and sugar planters. The system remained profitable, and there was little incentive to change it, despite the incredible brutality of slavery on Brazil's plantations. Because the planters needed a continual replenishment of the slave population, Brazil continued to import slaves long after most of the rest of the world had started to turn against that practice. The British Empire outlawed the Atlantic slave trade in 1807 and abolished slavery within its empire in 1833. After that, the British Navy sought to interdict slave ships wherever they were found, and by the end of the 1840s, this was heavily pinching Brazil's slave economy. Brazil finally outlawed the slave trade itself in 1850, but the institution of slavery clung to life for several more excruciating decades, until 1888, if you can believe it, though a partial step toward emancipation occurred in 1871. There was a little bit of modernization, the building of railroads and such, but Brazil was still overwhelmingly an agrarian economy at the time of the revolution that abolished the Second Empire in 1889. I'm going to skip over this revolution too, except to note that the key force in the overthrow of Dom Pedro II, Brazil's second emperor, in November 1889, was the army. The armed forces in Brazil had become, by the 1880s, heavily influenced by anti-monarchist sentiments. As we'll see, the military is an important actor on the political stage throughout most of Brazil's history. Now, don't get the wrong impression, though. The military, though elements of it opposed the monarchy, was neither monolithic in its political orientation nor committed across the board to political liberalism. Brazil's military and its attitudes toward the state were heavily influenced by a war that occurred between Brazil and Paraguay, one of its neighbors, in the 1860s and 70s. I don't have time to get into that. In the early years of what's called the First Republic, several factors were pulling at various institutions within Brazilian society, including the military. Ideas of liberalism and reform, practical desires to modernize Brazil's economy, questions about the role of the Catholic Church, racial differences, class differences, labor problems. Brazil in the late 19th century was also experiencing a lot of immigration. A lot of Germans and Italians immigrated to Brazil. Obviously, that's going to become important in the World Wars era. While Rio de Janeiro, with a population of 522,000 in 1890, was the capital and the largest city in Brazil, many immigrants were attracted to São Paulo, which had become the focal point of the coffee industry. An economic divide had always existed between Brazil's center-south region and what's called the Northeast, but that divide grew in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Rubber started to become an important export. Bicycles, which needed tires, became a fad in the 1890s, increasing demand for rubber. And of course, the rise of the automobile would accelerate that, no pun intended, and that also has implications for our main story, especially in the World War II era. In the new Brazilian Republic, federalism and regionalism were major factors. Brazil was organized into states, and all of them had powerful state governments, some more powerful on the national level than others. The main ones we need to know about, the basic factions at play, were Sao Paulo, this group was often called the Paulistas, and that state was basically controlled by an oligarchy of coffee planters, though industry would become more important over time. Then there was Minas Gerais, which is here. This faction came to be known as the Mineiros. While coffee was an important factor in Minas Gerais, it was less dominant. Cattle and industry were also significantly in the mix. Finally, we have Rio Grande do Sul, here, whose people came to be known as the Gaúchos. Gauchos is how that word would be pronounced in English. And no, they weren't all literally cowboys, but there is a grain of truth in that idea, as this area was heavily into cattle ranching. But immigrants, especially Italians, were important there. A disproportionate number of military officers were Gaúchos from the Rio Grande do Sul area. During the First Republic, it's helpful to think of Brazilian politics as sort of a constellation. The Mineiros and the Paulistas were the two main stars, but they were sort of orbited by the Gaúchos, who occasionally checked and balanced them and whose gravity influenced them. The relationship between these political actors is often called café com leite, or coffee and milk, supposedly meaning coffee from São Paulo and dairy from Minas Gerais. This is an oversimplification, but there are grains of truth in it. Because this First Republic period is not the main focus of this video, I'm not going to get more deeply into it than this. I always get in a little bit of trouble in my videos for saying that something in history is complicated, because there's always some yahoo out there who pretends that it's super simple. But trust me, this is complicated. Let's talk a little bit about this guy, Alfonso Peña, who was president of Brazil from 1906 to 1909. A Mineiro, Peña was the first Brazilian president to get the federal government heavily involved in propping up the coffee economy, trying to protect Brazil's income stream against the effects of fluctuations in the price of coffee, which had wreaked havoc during the economically unstable decade of the 1890s. Peña, like many Brazilian leaders after him, desired modernization, both of the country's infrastructure and its military assets. Men working under Peña, particularly Hermes de Fonseca, Minister of War, and Alexandrino Faria de Alencar, Minister of the Navy, sought to expand Brazil's navy. Among other factors, Brazil was constantly worried about its neighbor, Argentina, with which it generally had an acrimonious relationship. But more importantly for our purposes, this was the era of the dreadnought. A super battleship with that name was launched in Britain in 1906, at that time thought to be the most devastating weapon on the seas, and this sparked a naval arms race between Britain and Germany. That's well known, but there was also a naval arms race between Brazil, Argentina, and Chile in the same period. Brazil commissioned two dreadnought battleships, the Minas Gerais and the São Paulo, which triggered Argentina and Chile to order more ships of their own. These two ships, the Minas Gerais and São Paulo, remember them. They become important later. I should also tell you that throughout this whole period, there were revolts and rebellions constantly popping up in Brazil. Elements of the Brazilian Navy revolted in 1893 and 94. This was at roughly the same time as another revolt, the Federalist Revolution, sometimes described as a civil war, that was going on in southern Brazil. Later, in the 1890s, you had the War of Canudos in the state of Bahia in the northeast, and the Vaccine War in Rio de Janeiro in 1904, and countless other smaller conflicts. These arose out of economic factors, political differences over federalism, monarchism, and constitutional policies, public health policies, even religious revivals, plus constant grievances and controversies within the military itself, or between the Brazilian Army and the Brazilian Navy, which were sometimes at odds but not always, or political clashes between the economic factions, just an incredible amount of mishigas going on almost all the time. Again, thank your lucky stars that we don't need to get any more finer grained than this, or this video would be 11 hours long before we even got to World War I. Let's jump to November 1910, a little less than 4 years before the outbreak of World War I. Hermes de Fonseca, yes, the same guy who helped expand Brazil's navy, had just been elected president and was in his first week on the job when a revolt broke out within the navy he had helped modernize. It started with a mutiny aboard the battleship Minas Gerais. The spark was the flogging of a sailor aboard the ship. Flogging had been officially outlawed in the Brazilian Navy, but it was still practiced widely. There was also a racial dimension to this incident. More broadly, the revolt, which spread to the sister ship São Paulo, the cruiser Bahia, and another ship, came to be about essentially labor issues, overwork, low pay, and bad working conditions aboard the ships, as well as racism. I'm showing some clips here from Sergei Eisenstein's classic film Battleship Potemkin, which is about the Russian Revolution of 1905. Different situation, obviously, but some very similar issues were present in what was called the Revolt of the Lash, or the Revolt of the Whip, depending on how you translate its Portuguese name, Revolta da Chibata. The battleships took positions off Rio de Janeiro, then the capital of Brazil, and essentially held the city hostage until the government agreed to various demands for reform, which ultimately it did. This is the same navy and the same ships that would later feature heavily in Brazil's participation in World War I. The upshot of this rebellion was that Fonseca, the new president, began devoting financial resources to improving the shore facilities and living conditions for Brazil's naval personnel, instead of just lavishing money on big weapons, as Brazilian leaders had previously done. This would end up making a difference in World War I. Setting aside political events, I think it's worth some time to paint a picture of what Brazil was really like on the eve of World War I. In the early 20th century, Brazil was still overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. Because so much of its economy depended on exports such as coffee and sugar, the plantation system, which had been in place since colonial times, was still the way of life for many Brazilians and the pattern for many of its communities. Plantations were sort of economic and social units of their own. They grew the cash crops, but also everything else needed for the sustenance of the planter's family, as well as their own workforces: beans, corn, other staple foods, livestock like pigs, chickens, sheep, and goats. The Brazilian plantations were powered by water wheels or animals. The planter's estate would be the focal point, the big house where the rich family lived and directed the work, slaves up until 1888, after that, peasants or immigrants one step removed from slavery. Political and religious life emanated from the planter's estates. Throughout Brazil's history, devout Catholicism has existed uneasily alongside popular religions derived from West African traditions like Candomblé and Xungo. Brazilians have a long history of spiritual beliefs melded in unexpected ways with the Christianity of their colonial conquerors. But Catholic chapels and burial grounds were common on the big plantations. Elections in Brazil in this period were generally never done by secret ballot, and the plantation owners and their foremen would tell their workers, what few could vote, how they wanted them to cast their ballots. Elections generally were not an accurate expression of popular will. During the First Republic, only about 2% of Brazil's population could even vote at all. People who were illiterate, which was most of them, couldn't vote. Women didn't get the vote in Brazil until 1932. The plantations and ranches were connected to other parts of Brazil, particularly the port cities through which their goods moved to the rest of the world, through webs of commerce and communication. There were a few railroads in Brazil, a few telegraph lines, even fewer telephones or cars. The cities were very different than the countryside. There was a long hangover of slavery, even into the World War I era. A British observer, Alured Gray Bell, wrote of Rio de Janeiro in 1914, the year the war started in Europe, quote, "It cannot be denied that the long practice of slavery and its sudden final abolition have left a definite mark on Rio society. Hosts of Negro freedmen forsook the backcountry plantations for the capital, and today the great number of ex-slaves and their descendants, full-blood Africans or half-castes, is a distinctive feature of the city's life. The Brazilian behaves to his Negro fellow citizens much as an English government official in Egypt behaves to his Syrian and Armenian fellow workers, although sufficiently imperious and aristocratic not to treat Negro workmen and servants as his equals." End quote. This is a brief picture of the only country in South America to join the global conflict that broke out in 1914. Let's turn to that story in the next chapter. World War I is a pretty important thing on my channel. It features heavily in my most popular video to date, The Fall of the Monarchies, and I've done several others on various aspects of it. like the July crisis of 1914 that started it. I'm not going to rehash the story of how it began, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, and the chain of events that followed that. I do recommend the July crisis video, and just for fun, the one I did about the myth that the Archduke's assassin was only there because he stepped out to get a sandwich. That is not true. Anyway, go watch those if you haven't already. Suffice it to say, in August 1914, Europe blew up into war with the Central Powers, principally Germany and Austria-Hungary, fighting the Allies, principally France, Great Britain, and Russia. On August 4th, 1914, the day Britain went to war with Germany, Brazil's government officially declared neutrality in the conflict. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, also tried very hard to remain neutral. Wilson had a lot on his mind that week. His wife, Ellen, died on August 6th, just as the war in Europe was beginning. I told you at the beginning of the last chapter that Brazil was a very different animal than the other countries of Latin America. One of the ways in which it's different was its relationship with the United States. Unlike many other Latin American countries, the U.S. didn't invade or intervene directly in Brazilian affairs. In 1914 alone, the year the war started, the U.S. had troops or some kind of military presence in Nicaragua, Panama, the Dominican Republic, and Mexico. Wilson especially enjoyed sticking his nose into Latin American countries, but he avoided Brazil. Nevertheless, the U.S. was Brazil's major trade partner, but it also had significant trade relationships with Germany and Great Britain, which were affected by the war, obviously. The British blockaded Germany and the Central Powers as soon as the war broke out. They also suspended the importation of coffee. This meant a sharp decline in Brazil's exports and, as a consequence, a decline in customs revenue. Like many countries at this time, customs duties were the main source of income for the Brazilian federal government. The British also blacklisted a number of Brazilian companies and commercial interests on the suspicion that they might be doing business with Germany. Brazil's economy slumped in the last months of 1914. For all the problems the British were causing and the many German immigrants who lived in Brazil, you might think that Brazil's natural tendency would be to tilt toward Germany. But perhaps surprisingly, the country was mostly pro-Allied despite its neutrality. One major factor was that Germany owed Brazil the equivalent of about 7 million British pounds for coffee that was seized in Hamburg when the war started. And as I'll talk about in a few minutes, Brazil's ships increasingly came into hostile contact with Germans on the high seas, which, as you already know from chapter 1 of this video, was ultimately the spark of Brazil's declaration of war. But we're not there yet. At the time the war broke out in Europe, the Brazilian federal government was distracted by a much more consequential conflict going on in southern Brazil, known as the Contestado War. While at first glance this conflict looks like just another entry on the list of revolts and rebellions that erupted in Brazil during this period, in reality it was much deeper than that and much more protracted. It involved so many undercurrents in Brazilian history at this time: industrialization, labor, immigrants, religion, the role of the military, and the authority of the Brazilian federal government. There's no way I could possibly do the Contestado War any sort of justice in just a few minutes in this video. Suffice it to say, it blew up in the states of Santa Catarina and Paraná in October 1912, sparked by local workers who had just been laid off after having built a railroad between Sao Paulo and Rio Grande do Sul. A Messianic holy man, Miguel Lucena Boaventura, who called himself José Maria, had attracted a significant following in the area. The military, alarmed by reports not entirely reliable that José Maria had set up a rival monarchy that flouted the authority of the Brazilian government, attacked, killing him and a few others. Naturally, José Maria became a martyr, and his followers refused to believe he was dead. They rampaged through the countryside, destroying villages, railway stations, and a sawmill. The government sent several successive military expeditions to wipe them out. The war dragged on until the fall of 1916. Brazil was also undergoing a change of leadership at the time World War I broke out. The important and groundbreaking President Hermes de Fonseca, who was the first actual military officer elected president of Brazil, was leaving office in 1914. In the presidential election that year, remember I told you that elections weren't exactly fair and competitive in this period. A man called Venceslau Braz, a Mineiro, was elected president. He took office on November 15, 1914, as the hottest phase of the Contestado War was getting going, and as stalemate set in on the Western Front in Europe. While the war in Europe was not their main concern, Brazilian leaders did take note of it. In 1914 and 15, General José Caetano de Faria, the new Minister of War, observed what was happening in Europe as well as down south in the ongoing Contestado conflict, and decided that the Brazilian army had to be modernized and reorganized. He looked to the example of the Japanese army in the 1904 Russo-Japanese War as a model for what to aspire to. In the meantime, while the army reorganized itself, Brazil's merchant navy found themselves on the front lines of World War I, those being the sea lanes. Because the major powers requisitioned so many of their own merchant ships into military service, the merchant marine forces of neutral countries like Brazil found themselves much more in demand and often operating farther from their shores than they did before. In 1914, Brazil had the largest merchant marine fleet in Latin America, and by 1916, Brazilian ships were hauling cargo and passengers to and from a lot of ports in Europe and the Atlantic that had previously been dominated by British ships. As a result, Brazilian ships found themselves in waters that were frequently patrolled by German U-boats. Submarines were the only effective naval weapon the Germans had as a result of the British blockade of their coast. You see where this is going. Sinkings, of course. The first came on May 2, 1916, when a ship called the Rio Branco was torpedoed by the German sub UB-27. However, nobody was killed. Furthermore, the ship, although technically Brazilian, was at the time being leased to the British. Its crew was mostly Norwegians, and the sinking occurred in the North Sea, very far from Brazilian waters. Surely President Braz would let that one go, right? In December 1916, German destroyers seized the Brazilian ship Rio Pardo in the North Sea between Britain and the Netherlands. Then, the following month, January 1917, Germany announced the resumption of its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which it had suspended nearly 2 years earlier after U.S. protests following the sinking of the Lusitania. Various nations officially protested this policy. Brazil was one of them, lodging 2 official protests during the month of February 1917. On April 4, 1917, the German submarine UB-32 shot a torpedo into the Brazilian steamer Paraná, which was near the end of its voyage from Rio de Janeiro to Le Havre, France. There was no warning. The Germans suggested that the ship had struck a British or French mine, which was taken as an insult in Brazil. Nobody bought it. 2 days later, the United States Congress declared war on Germany. The political center of gravity in the Western Hemisphere was shifting toward belligerence against the Central Powers. While Brazil broke diplomatic relations with Germany on April 10th, largely as a result of the Paraná incident, the country reaffirmed its neutrality on April 25th. However, President Braz was moving closer to war. The neutrality that Brazil reaffirmed on April 25th was in fact partially revoked on June 1st. Another ship, the Tijuca, had been torpedoed off the French coast on May 20th. 2 days later, President Braz addressed the Brazilian Congress, and he said, quote, "The Republic has thus recognized that one of the belligerents is an integral part of the American continent, and that we are bound to this belligerent by a traditional friendship and by a similarity of political opinion in the defense of the vital interests of America and the principles accepted by international law." End quote. The president of Brazil had by this time already authorized the arming of its merchant vessels. An even more significant step was the seizure of all German merchant vessels in Brazilian waters. There were 45 of them total, but 33 were in bad shape and couldn't be put to sea without extensive repairs. Because of the shortage of merchant shipping, both France and the US wanted these ships. The Brazilian government eventually made a deal to lease them to France in exchange for France buying a bunch of coffee, as well as a cash payment. The U.S. pushed Brazil closer to war. On June 14, 1917, 4 armored cruisers of the U.S. Navy, Pittsburgh, South Dakota, Pueblo, and Frederick, came to Brazil. I mentioned that in Chapter 1. As I said at that time, my great-grandfather was aboard the USS South Dakota during that voyage. He may have been one of the American sailors who paraded through the streets of Rio de Janeiro to great applause, just before the American Admiral William B. Caperton attended several lavish dinner parties thrown by Rio's elite to welcome him. War isn't always hell, apparently. Even before Brazil's official declaration of war, the Brazilian Navy began working with the US, Great Britain, and France to divide up the South Atlantic into patrol zones to guard against those nasty German U-boats. Because they weren't officially at war yet, however, the Navy could only patrol Brazil's coastal waters, but Brazilian ships would alert the Allies if they saw German vessels farther out. The Brazilian Navy also got spare parts to repair its ships from the United States, which were badly needed. From August 1917 onward, Rio de Janeiro was protected by an anti-submarine net. Some Germans were thinking of sending subs into Brazilian waters. The senior German diplomat in Buenos Aires, Karl von Luxemburg, made the mistake of putting his plans in writing to the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, suggesting both that subs be sent and also that Germans in Brazil could be used as a tool against the Brazilian government. The dispatches were intercepted and published in the papers. It didn't help that in his letters, Luxemburg said of Brazilians, quote, "The people under thin veneer are Indians." Germany's racist contempt for the people of Brazil would come back to haunt them in the Nazi era. In October 1917 came the sinking of the ship Macau. I covered that at the beginning of this video in Chapter 1, as well as Brazil's declaration of war and a brief account of its military history during World War I, which is mostly a naval story. I won't recap that here. However, it's worth asking, why is it mostly a naval story? Why didn't Brazil, the only Latin American nation to declare war on the Central Powers, send an army to fight in France? Some officers in Brazil's army wanted to do exactly that. There was even a plan drawn up called the Calugueiras Plan to send a Brazilian expeditionary force to France, to be financed in part by the United States. However, military and political leaders perceived that there was a strong popular sentiment that Brazilians shouldn't be sent overseas, essentially to die in a war that many people regarded as a civil war among the major colonial powers of the world. Once that war was over, people thought, the colonizers' eyes would turn toward countries like Brazil. Furthermore, the headaches that the army had in suppressing the Contestado rebellion demonstrated that Brazil still had a lot of organizational and logistical problems to solve. Trying to project Brazilian power overseas into Europe would probably be a disaster. In the Brazilian army, the main issue during World War I was to try to get the country's military out from under its dependence on foreign supplies, particularly of ammunition. Brazil's steel industry was embryonic in the 19-teens, and many military and political leaders recognized that it had to be ramped up as a measure of national security. That issue pops up again in World War II, as we'll see. A Brazilian army mission to Washington, D.C. toward the end of 1917 concluded that as munitions factories in the U.S. were struggling to meet the demand for ammunition for American forces, there wasn't much that they would be able to do to help jumpstart Brazil's own munitions production. This meant that Brazil's principal contribution to the war effort would be food crops and other material goods, not troops. But as Brazil already had a functional navy, World War I was principally a naval war for them. The Brazilian army did, however, send a mission of doctors to France in 1918 to help out. In March 1918, just before the Great German Offensive on the Western Front, there was another presidential election in Brazil. Rodrigues Alves, who had been president from 1902 to 1906, won the election with a suspicious 99% of the vote. He was scheduled to take office in November. On September 16, 1918, the British ship SS Demerara docked in Rio de Janeiro after a voyage from Dakar, Senegal. That ship brought the dreaded Spanish influenza to Brazil. The flu, which was raking the world in the fall of 1918, was merciless. By late October, 500,000 people, about half of Rio de Janeiro's population, was sick. There weren't enough hearses to carry the dead to the graveyards, and not enough grave diggers to bury them. The whole country came to a halt. Even food supplies were disrupted. There are reports of people dying of starvation. On October 25th, the army set up 4 temporary hospitals in Rio. Eventually, the pandemic subsided. As many as 28,000 people may have been killed by influenza in the capital, and we have no idea how many out in the countryside. One of the dead was the president-elect, Rodrigues Alves, who died on January 16, 1919. The vice president who'd been elected in March, Delfim Moreira da Costa Ribeiro, was forced to take the oath of office as president. He served only a few months. Epitácio Pessoa won a snap election in July 1919 and was quickly sworn into office. The war in Europe ended somewhat abruptly in November 1918, when the Germans accepted the Allies' armistice terms. Having fought in the war, Brazil was entitled to be represented at the peace conference at Versailles, France, in 1919. Incidentally, the head of the Brazilian delegation to Versailles was Epitácio Pessoa, then a senator. In fact, he won the snap presidential election while he was still in France negotiating with the Allies. Pessoa drove a hard bargain. Remember those 45 German ships that Brazil seized before it declared war? The redistribution of German ships to the victorious Allies as reparations for ships sunk by German U-boats was a major issue at Versailles. Pessoa wanted those ships, of which 43 were left by the end of the war. The big Western Allies wanted to distribute them based on the ratio of ship losses they had suffered. Pessoa argued that by leasing some of the ships and trying to buy the others, France and the United States had implicitly recognized Brazil's ownership of them. He refused to sign the Treaty of Versailles for Brazil unless they decided this issue in his favor. France backed down and the U.S. followed. Brazil got the ships, plus 2 old German torpedo boats and a host of other ships from the other former Central Powers. Brazil signed the treaty on June 28, 1919. When the war was over, Britain and the United States both competed pretty heavily for Brazil's attention, at least where military matters were concerned. Naval missions went back and forth between Rio de Janeiro, Washington, and London into the early 1920s. Neither of the most powerful victorious allies took Brazil for granted, and both the British and Americans wanted good relations with Brazil. On the whole, Brazil came through World War I pretty successfully, especially for having been economically devastated at the beginning of it. It had a bunch of new ships, at least a start on modernizing its armed forces, some good trade deals for its products, especially coffee, and the respect of the victorious allies. The cost in lives to achieve this was relatively low. We don't often think of Brazil as being a big player in World War I, but from a purely cost-benefit analysis, very few other countries achieved more for the effort it put in than Brazil did. Unfortunately, the good times wouldn't last. The decade of the 1920s would prove to be a troubled and tumultuous one for the Brazilians. That story is in the next chapter. Brazil's population in 1890 was about 14.3 million. 30 years later, just after World War I, it was 30.6 million. The total foreign-born population in 1926 was about 1.6 million, many Germans and Japanese, but also Italians who tended to settle in Sao Paulo. Though the country had come a long way since the 1889 revolution, it was still overwhelmingly rural, with only a thin crust of urbanization along the very long coastline. The military, particularly the Brazilian army, was restive during the 1920s. This was the era of a movement called tenenchismo, or lieutenantism in English. This is complicated, and a lot has been written on it. Basically, younger officers in the Brazilian army, they tended to be, though not all were, lieutenants, were upset with the ruling oligarchies, the old coffee, sugar, and cattle aristocrats whose puppets had, for the most part, traded off the presidency since Brazil became a republic in 1889. These officers observed how modern militaries worked during World War I, and they learned a lot from the military missions of the US, Britain, and eventually France that visited Brazil in the years following the war. The Tenentes wanted reform and modernization. This is Fort Copacabana in Rio de Janeiro. It was built by the Brazilian Army beginning in 1908. Completed in 1914, the year World War I broke out. Here, on July 5, 1922, a group of military men tried to take over this fort to prevent the inauguration of Arthur Bernardes, who in March had won the presidential election. Bernardes was perceived as being hostile to the military, mainly as a result of a series of fake letters that were forged by his political enemies to make him look bad. The revolt wasn't well organized, and it quickly failed, but it is generally regarded as the true beginning of the tenenchismo, or lieutenantist, movement. 2 years later, in fact on the same day, July 5th, the tenentes were at it again. A group of military men rose in revolt in São Paulo on July 5th, 1924, taking over several headquarters buildings and eventually occupying this building, the Campos Elíseos Palace, which was the seat of São Paulo's state government at the time. They effectively captured the whole city of São Paulo and occupied it. The rest of the army, loyal to the government, sought to get São Paulo back. A 3-week campaign of bombing and shelling ordered by Bernardes destroyed 1,800 buildings in the city and killed at least 500 people, probably closer to 1,000, most of them civilians. São Paulo, therefore, was one of the first cities in the world to suffer from the kind of indiscriminate bombing attacks that would horrify the world years later at Guernica in the Spanish Civil War and later during World War II. Bernardes was vilified as the destroyer of São Paulo. The rebellion was quelled in São Paulo violently, but it spread elsewhere. Riots and revolts broke out in several cities, including Mato Grosso, Manaus, and the state of Rio Grande do Sul. After the rebellion was put down in São Paulo, a young captain, Luiz Carlos Prestes, organized an army of rebels that came to be known as the Prestes Column. Only about 1,500 strong, the column marched throughout the interior of Brazil, trying to get people to join their cause to overthrow the oligarchs ruling from Rio de Janeiro. The Prestes column tangled with government forces several times and made a famous stand at Iguaçu Falls, a well-known landmark in Brazil. But their main goal at igniting a broad-based revolution in Brazil ultimately failed. Eventually, in 1927, the Prestes rebels fled across the border into Bolivia and Paraguay. In November 1924, there was also a revolt in the Navy aboard the battleship São Paulo. Remember that ship? We've seen it before. After taking over the ship, the mutineers couldn't get a whole lot of people to join them. So eventually they sailed the dreadnought to Montevideo, where the mutineers jumped ship. The problem with the Tenentes was that they didn't really have a program. They were angry at the government and the oligarchs, and they wanted change, but there was no specific program that they wanted to put into practice or a single leader that they could rally behind. There was obviously a great deal of discontent in Brazil in the 1920s, and the government didn't function the way it should have. But what to do about it, nobody could agree. The labor movement was becoming restive too in this period. A wave of strikes had broken out in several of Brazil's cities in the World War I era, most notably a major general strike in São Paulo in the summer of 1917. They were mainly caused by inflation and price hikes related to the war, but after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, Brazil started to become much more of an ideological battleground. I'm going to talk about that story in more detail in Chapter 6. The hated Artur Bernardes was succeeded, peacefully for a change, by Washington Luiz in November 1926. Luiz was a Paulista, although he'd been born in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The old trade-off system between the Paulistas and Mineiros was still functioning strong. With the defeat of the Prestes column in 1927, early in Luiz's term, it looked like things were calming down in Brazil politically. But there were problems on the horizon. The coffee market was a problem. Remember the previous president, Epitácio Pessoa? That was the one who was elected while he was negotiating at Versailles. Well, between 1921 and 1923, he printed a bunch of paper money, in part to prop up the price of coffee. This had the effect of driving up inflation and driving down exchange rates, which, happens when you print a bunch of paper money that's not really backed by anything. Anyway, when Luiz got into office, Brazil had a bunch of foreign debts that were coming due in 1927, and signs were troubling about the country's ability to pay them back. One of the things he did was to transfer the responsibility for supporting the coffee market, valorization it was called, from the Brazilian federal government to the state of Sao Paulo. This did help the situation, but left some problems in its wake. Because the Brazilian federal government and eventually the São Paulo state government had supported the coffee industry for so long, the big coffee growers got used to basically state-guaranteed profits. During the 1920s, they took out a lot of high-interest loans to plant more coffee. Gee, do you think that that's going to come back to haunt them? In the middle of 1929, the political wheels began turning toward the upcoming presidential election. Because, as I've said a couple of times now, these weren't really fair elections. The question of presidential succession was always a bit touchy. As you also know, the president's chair was, per informal agreement, supposed to be traded off between the Paulistas and the Mineiros. Luiz let it be known, however, that his choice of successor was a man called Julio Prestes, who was also a Paulista. Now, don't confuse Julio Prestes, the presidential candidate, with Luiz Carlos Prestes, the lieutenantist and leader of the Prestes column. Two different guys, not related, so far as I know. I told you it's complicated. So, Luiz wanted Prestes to succeed him. The states of Minas Gerais, Paraíba, and Rio Grande do Sul, in other words, the Mineiros and the Gaúchos, cried foul. The next president was supposed to be a Mineiro, not another Paulista. Right? Politicians from these states formed a new political front called the Liberal Alliance, and they nominated Getúlio Vargas, governor of Rio Grande do Sul, as their presidential candidate. His running mate was João Pessoa, who happened to be the nephew of the former president, Epitácio Pessoa. Now, just a note here. I call Vargas the governor of Rio Grande do Sul. The technical term for this office is president, meaning president of that particular state. But I'm using the word governor to avoid confusion with the office of the actual president of Brazil, meaning the federal government of Brazil. I am aware of the nomenclature. Don't at me in the comments about it, Brazilians, please. Anyway, Vargas and the Liberal Alliance had the support of the Tenentes, the lieutenantist movement within the military that had caused all that mishigas earlier in the 1920s. Now remember that. It becomes important later. This famous room is far from Brazil. It's the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. Something that happened in this room had a profound effect on Brazilian history and the history of the rest of the world, too. It looked a lot different in October 1929. I'm talking, of course, about the stock market crash, actually two crashes that occurred within a few days of each other. The way historians usually talk about the Great Crash of 1929 in relation to the Great Depression it triggered makes it seem like it was pretty much instantaneous, that Wall Street and the world went from Manhattan penthouse to the breadline basically overnight. In reality, it took a few months for the full effect of the crash to ripple outward throughout the world's economy. But that transition from economic stability to Great Depression was especially rough in Brazil. I'm going to talk about that and the political turmoil that resulted in the next chapter. We need to understand this story if the context of Brazil's participation in World War II is going to make any sense. Pop quiz. Worldwide depression, bank failures, companies going down, mass unemployment, trade and tariff wars among nations, political turmoil. What are people in this situation going to be drinking more of? If you said alcohol, you're right. What are they going to be drinking less of? Coffee. Coffee consumption declined in the early 1930s. This was a huge problem for Brazil because, as you know, coffee was its biggest export. Remember in the last chapter, those coffee growers who took out high-interest loans to plant more coffee, expecting that the government would bail them out if they got into trouble. Yeah, those people were ruined in the Depression, which hit Brazil hard because of the crash in both coffee prices and coffee consumption. By the middle of 1930, the Depression and its economic effects had pretty much primed Brazil for a political explosion. Things were going to change, and they did. On March 1st, 1930, about 4 months after the stock market crash, the Brazilian presidential election went off, and it was ostensibly a huge victory for Júlio Prestes, the hand-picked Paulista successor of President Washington Luiz. But the vote was fixed. Naturally, the Liberal Alliance was outraged, even though they also fixed the vote in Vargas's favor in the places they controlled, most notably Rio Grande do Sul. Look at this street corner in Recife, Brazil. Specifically, look at that pink building with the green shutters. This building has a long history. There used to be a German-owned department store here, which was set on fire in 1917 when Brazil entered World War I. After the war, a pastry shop called the Confeitaria Gloria occupied the premises. It was here in the pastry shop on July 26, 1930, when a man called João Dantas walked up to João Pessoa, the governor of Paraíba and the new vice president-elect of Brazil, pulled out a gun and pumped 5 slugs into him. While there obviously were political implications to this assassination, there were personal ones too. Dantas was having an affair with a noted poet and feminist, Anaíde Baires, and Pessoa seized and made public some personal letters that prove this affair, humiliating Dantas in public. This event is still controversial in Brazilian society, but it did happen here in that building. The assassination gave a shot in the arm, no pun intended, to the Liberal Alliance and the enemies of President Luiz and the government. Finally, opposition to the government and the oligarchies it represented was galvanized, and the military was on the forefront of it. The key military figure in what happened in Brazil in 1930 was a lieutenant colonel in the Brazilian army called Pedro Aurelio de Góes Monteiro. Remember that business in the last chapter with the Prestes column? Well, as a junior officer, Góes was part of the loyalist army that opposed them, but the whole experience alarmed him. He thought the whole Brazilian military was antiquated and unprepared, especially if Brazil should suffer an invasion by its most likely enemy, Argentina. Góes started thinking about a revolution that would remake the Brazilian state and facilitate the rebuilding of the army. In the months following the murder of Pessoa, Góes started meeting with various conspirators plotting against the government, and eventually he became chief of staff of the revolutionaries. On October 3, 1930, Góes, working with a civilian lawyer named Osvaldo Arunha, instigated a military revolt in the city of Porto Alegre, the capital of Rio Grande do Sul state. Getúlio Vargas, the governor of that state and the Liberal Alliance's defeated candidate for president, was waiting in the wings to take power. The revolution spread outward from Rio Grande do Sul. It's complicated, but I'm going to skip over most of it. Suffice it to say, although it looked like the state of Sao Paulo would resist the revolt by force, a military junta overthrew outgoing President Luiz on October 24th. Although the military council tried briefly to stay in power, there were popular demonstrations against it, and Vargas told them, just FYI, that he had 30,000 men and was planning to march on Rio. He also said, quote, "I am merely a transitory expression of the collective will," end quote. This from the man who would rule Brazil for the next 15 years. This obelisk, built in 1906, stands at the corner of Avenida Rio Branco and Avenida President Wilson in Rio de Janeiro, which was then the capital. On November 3, 1930, a group of military men from Rio Grande do Sul, Gaúchos, hitched their horses to this obelisk as a symbolic gesture of both victory in the revolution and submission to the new president of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas. Brazil's revolution of 1930 was one of many authoritarian and military coups that occurred in Latin America at the heights of the Great Depression. The period, known as the First Republic, was over. The real meaning of the revolution of 1930 was that a different set of elites took power in Brazil that year. The old oligarchs, coffee growers, sugar and dairy producers, cattle ranchers, etc., were displaced by military officers, technicians, and bureaucrats, and career-minded politicians. The new state under Vargas increasingly tilted toward modernization and industrialization. Why do we need to know about the Revolution of 1930 in a story about Brazil's participation in the World Wars? Because World War II would prove to be a major milestone on the road to these ultimate goals, especially industrialization, that Vargas set the country on when he came to power at the beginning of the 30s. Vargas was an authoritarian. He governed Brazil with dictatorial powers, and although he was not a military officer at the time of the revolution, his power base was the military. However, unlike Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, or the military rulers of Japan, Vargas's regime was not based on an explicit ideology of fascism or militarism. This is an important distinction. This is one of the most famous landmarks of Brazil, the statue called Christ the Redeemer atop the mountain known as Corcovado, overlooking Rio de Janeiro. Construction on it started in 1922, but it was completed and unveiled in October 1931, about a year after Vargas came to power. Obviously, it's a major tourist attraction to this day, but it's symbolic in our story because one of the pillars of the Vargas regime was the Catholic Church, which had felt sidelined during the First Republic era. The new government was careful to court the approval and cooperation of the Catholic Church, which in turn granted legitimacy to the regime. Millions of Brazil's devout Catholics generally supported the government. Vargas had his problems, of course. Revolts and rebellions continued to erupt after he was in office. The most serious of them was the Constitutionalist Revolution, also sometimes known as the Paulista War, which broke out in the state of São Paulo in July 1932. This conflict went on for several months and eventually ended after the Brazilian Navy blockaded the port of Santos. The elites of São Paulo state and Minas Gerais weren't that happy with the Vargas government, but this failed rebellion demonstrated that they were basically stuck with it. As a result of the Constitutionalist Revolution, Vargas did support the drafting of a new constitution for Brazil, which went into effect in 1934, despite the fact that Vargas himself sharply criticized the finished document. It didn't end up being enforced for long, being suspended later on, as we'll talk about. Vargas was officially elected president by the Constitutional Assembly, not a nationwide election, in July 1934, with his term to run until May 1938. Remember that. It becomes important later. Vargas also faced terrible problems with the coffee markets, as all previous Brazilian leaders had. Starting in 1931, the government bought large stores of coffee with money it received from export taxes, then destroyed a large portion of the coffee to prevent it from being exported, and to try to keep the world price of coffee up. This policy continued into World War II. Sugar and alcohol were also controlled by federal government policy. Gone were the days when the coffee barons controlled Brazil's destiny. Of course, the story of the 1930s across the world, going into World War II, heavily involves the ideologies that ended up in armed conflict with one another, in China and Spain with its civil wars, and eventually in Europe during World War II, the struggle between fascism or some other form of authoritarianism and communism. That struggle had a dimension in Brazil too. That's the subject we turn to next. one issue I haven't talked about very much in this video so far, but which was unquestionably very important in Brazil in this period, is labor. Since the time of the abolition of slavery in 1888, wage labor became crucial in Brazil, as immigrants, particularly from Germany, Italy, and Japan, the future Axis countries, arrived in large numbers. A history of the Brazilian labor movement is beyond our scope here. Suffice it to say, in the 1900s and 19-teens, the World War I era, Brazilian labor movements were split ideologically between socialists and anarchists, with anarchism generally growing faster. Labor relations remained pretty unsettled during the First Republic. But when the Vargas government came to power in 1930, it sought to quell labor unrest by both protecting labor unions from the police and also requiring them to register and abide by certain regulations. For example, the Vargas government's Decree number 19770, which came out in March 1931, specified that each class of workers could have only one union to represent them. Nevertheless, important workers' rights were established, such as the 8-hour workday, protections for women and children workers, pensions, that sort of thing. Guarantees that hadn't existed before in Brazil. In the 1930s, ideological divisions began to appear in Brazil for really the first time. In October 1932, a group of right-wing intellectuals founded something called the Brazilian Integralist Movement, called AIB after its initials in Portuguese. The AIB's platform was God, Fatherland, and Family, and denounced the world financial system as being controlled by Jews. Does this sound a lot like the platform of a particular German man whose ludicrous mustache made him look a bit like Charlie Chaplin? Yeah, that's not a coincidence. AIB was Brazil's first consequential fascist party. Of course, especially in the 1930s, wherever you find fascists, you're going to find communists they're looking to beat up. And that was true in Brazil, too. Brazil's Communist Party had existed since 1922, but really became a major presence only after 1934. Remember Luiz Carlos Prestes, who led the Prestes column during the revolts of the 1920s? Well, he went to Moscow in the early 30s, married a member of the Comintern, that was Stalin's agency tasked with exporting communism overseas, and after he returned to Brazil, Prestes became a major leader of opposition to Vargas on the Brazilian left. Even more important than the Communist Party of Brazil was an organization called the National Liberation Alliance, or ANL, from its Portuguese title. Prestes became the ANL's honorary president in early 1935. The ANL went viral, you could say, and had 100,000 members across Brazil by July. Vargas, alarmed at this development, outlawed it. The Communist Party took revenge by fomenting yet another rebellion against the government, which got going in the city of Natal in November 1935. The revolt failed. The military, which Vargas had firm control over, crushed it, deploying troops in Rio de Janeiro and Recife. The failed 1935 communist uprising accelerated Vargas's already authoritarian tendencies. In 1936, the government formed a National Commission for Stopping Communism and a special National Security Tribunal to investigate and try communists. In the crackdown, Luiz Prestes was arrested, tortured, and thrown in prison. His wife, a German-born Jew, was deported to Germany and eventually perished in the Holocaust. Under the recently established constitution, a presidential election was coming up in January 1938. Given what we've already discussed, you should be able to predict what's going to happen. Vargas, his regime now increasingly authoritarian and anti-communist, distrusted all the major political candidates, who by the summer of 1937 were starting to gear up their campaigns. He and the military elites who brought him in weren't about to give up power. In November 1937, there was a coup, best described as a self-coup, an attempt by a leader already in power to subvert the transfer of power to someone else. The pretext for Vargas's coup was a forgery called the Cohen Plan. This was a totally fake document, ginned up by the Brazilian military and supposedly intercepted, which described the plans for a communist uprising in Brazil, which it said would lead to massacres, rape, and pillaging, and the destruction of churches. The Cohen plan was heavily publicized in Brazil's newspapers and caused a public furor. There was a heavy element of anti-Semitism to the Cohen plan, right down to its name, which sought to pin the plans for a communist takeover on Jews. The vile anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews controlling the world's financial system and being ultimately behind the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 were one of the major bases of Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany. And unfortunately, these hateful theories had a lot of adherents in Brazil, too. The Cohen plan forgery was also well in line with the tradition of political document fakery that was very common in Brazil. Remember the assassination at the pastry shop in Recife that indirectly triggered the revolution of 1930? The issue there also involved fake political letters being exposed in the press. If you wanted to smear a politician or a whole group of people in Brazil in this period, the best way to do it was to write something inflammatory, attribute it to your target, and let the newspapers do the rest. The racism inherent in the Cohen plan fakery just made it even more irresistible. Oh, guess who leaked the fake Cohen plan to military authorities in the first place? None other than Pedro Aurelio G. Góes Monteiro, the guy who had a major hand in the 1930 revolution, who by now was Army Chief of Staff. President Getúlio Vargas wrote in his diary, which was not made public until the 1990s, the night before the coup. Here's what he said, quote, "In light of this," meaning the Cohen plan, "it was necessary to move quickly, taking advantage of surprise. I had the Chief of Police and the Minister of Justice summoned immediately. On the next day, the 11th of November, in the morning, the two houses of Congress found themselves guarded by the police. At 10 o'clock a.m., the ministry met and we signed the Constitution. In the afternoon, I went to the Canidé Palace and worked until 8 o'clock at night, when I delivered the manifesto to the nation on the radio." End quote. What the manifesto to the nation ultimately meant was what's called the Estado Novo, translation New State. It was a dictatorship where Vargas could rule by decree. All political parties were outlawed within a month. There would be no transfer of power, no election, nothing. Not even the customary rigged plebiscite various dictators, including Napoleon and Hitler, used as a fig leaf to pretend like the people had voted for them. There was token opposition, ironically from the Integralists, the fascist party, but it was crushed in a shootout at the presidential palace in May 1938. Though it was a dramatic development, the coup of November 1937 and the establishment of the Estado Novo wasn't really a major break with Brazil's recent past, which was already skewing heavily toward authoritarianism. Vargas's major overarching project to bring Brazil out of the Depression and continue its industrialization and modernization continued as before. He proceeded to upgrade and modernize the military, buying artillery from Nazi Germany and Czechoslovakia, ships from Britain, and planes from the United States. He was especially interested in building out Brazil's steel industry. That, as we'll see, had a major role in Brazil's World War II story. By early 1938, when Vargas finished consolidating his power, war clouds were gathering everywhere. The aforementioned German guy with the stupid mustache essentially snatched Austria and stuck it on to Germany in March 1938. Later in the year, Hitler would go on to swallow part of Czechoslovakia, served to him on a silver platter by Neville Chamberlain, and a few months later, he came back to gobble up the rest of it. Japan had invaded central and southern China the previous year, 1937, continuing the conquest it had begun back in 1931. Franco's fascists were turning the tide of the Spanish Civil War. Anyone with half a brain could see that another major world conflict was coming. Getúlio Vargas, the dictator of Brazil, knew that no less than anyone else. How the conflict ultimately came to Brazil and what Vargas did about it is the subject of the next chapter. Hitler and the Nazi regime were interested in Brazil. As you might imagine, the mustache was delighted when Vargas and the military overthrew the constitutional order in 1937 and began taking actions and policies that were very much in line with European fascist countries. Indeed, Brazil was one of the few Latin American countries that Hitler cared anything about, largely because of the concentration of ethnic Germans there that could, in the event of war with Western powers, become a fifth column that might be useful to Germany. The Nazi Party had a foreign organization called the Auslands Organization, which was aimed, as you might imagine, at spreading the racist ideology of Nazism to various other countries. The Auslands pumped Nazi propaganda into Brazil through sports and cultural clubs. Additionally, the Nazis sometimes invited Brazilian military men to observe German military maneuvers. Góes Monteiro, there he is again, was one recipient of these sorts of invitations. For their part, Brazil seemed to be embracing a closer relationship with Germany. In addition to ordering weapons from the famous Krupp Company, Brazil put in a $55 million order to Krupp in 1938. Between 1933, when Hitler came to power, and 1938, the first full year of Vargas's Estado Novo, Germany increased in importance as a trade partner, taking 12% of Brazil's exports in 1933 to 25% in 1938. Not bad for two countries that had been at war only 20 years earlier. However, the look of Brazil being pro-German in this period, which is noted by a lot of historians, is a little misleading. There is some evidence that Brazilian leaders understood that if forced to choose a side, they were much better off cozying up to the United States. In March 1939, Henrico Gaspar Dutra, Brazil's Minister of War, told a New York Times reporter, when asked if the Brazilian army was pro-German, he said in a quote that did not wind up in the paper, "Not at all. The Army is intent on perfecting its professional efficiency and is solely pro-Brazilian. For help along this line, it has looked to the United States rather than Germany." End quote. A few months later, General Góes, who seemed outwardly to admire Nazi Germany and who had sent that phony Cohen plan to trigger the 1937 coup, visited the United States and received a friendly reception. He even met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House. The key issue for Vargas, though, was modernization and industrialization. Steel was a major part of this. At the end of the 1930s, as the war clouds gathered over Europe and East Asia, Brazil was looking for a way to jumpstart its steel production with a state-owned Brazilian company. This would eventually become CSN, which still exists today. It didn't quite exist yet in 1939, but it was an idea that Vargas heavily pursued. In order to get going, a big Brazilian steel plant, which would eventually be built in Volta Redonda in Rio de Janeiro state, needed a lot of foreign investment, and considerably before steel actually began rolling off the assembly lines. Where was this investment going to come from? Vargas saw really only two realistic possibilities: Brazil's two biggest trading partners, the United States or Germany. In early September 1939, the mustache kicked off the war in Europe with his monstrous invasion of Poland. I did a video about the last month of peace, August 1939. Go watch that if you haven't already, though you won't find Brazil mentioned in it. What you must understand about the beginning of World War II in Europe is that most of the people in power at that time had been around in World War I, and there was a profound feeling of, oh crap, well here we go again. For countries not directly involved at the start, like Brazil or even the US, there was at least a playbook to follow. Brazil declared its neutrality in the European War once it began, as it had done at the beginning of the First War. Behind the scenes, Americans and Brazilians were already quietly negotiating. The US wanted bases for American ships and planes somewhere on the Brazilian coast. Brazil, of course, wanted armaments, planes, and especially investment for that Volta Redonda steel plant. Not much happened, though, until after Hitler's lightning conquest of the Low Countries and France in May 1940, and the British evacuation from Dunkirk. Now, FDR and Churchill had a strategic problem that tangentially involved Brazil. Look at this bulge on the northeast coast of Brazil. If Germany used French colonies in West Africa as a jumping-off point, theoretically they might choose to land here and establish bases to disrupt shipping in the Americas, or the real nightmare scenario for American planners, to strike at the Panama Canal. However realistic this scenario was, probably not very. The fact that people like U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall were thinking about it only increased Vargas's bargaining power. Beginning in June 1940 and continuing into the first few months of 1941, Brazil made several deals with the United States. These included loans from the U.S. to Brazil, guaranteed exports of Brazilian goods to the U.S. at favorable prices, and permission for U.S. bases in Brazil's northeast, including air bases that would be built out via a sweetheart government contract by none other than Pan American Airways, which already had a substantial presence in Latin America. So there's another crossover with the previous video I did. I didn't talk much about Brazil in that one, but all these subjects at least sort of touch each other. While I'm discussing US-Brazil relations, I'm going to make a preemptive strike here. Probably someone in the comments to this video will eventually claim that the United States was planning to invade Brazil during World War II, and that's the only reason Brazil joined the Allies. I know that'll happen because I got similar comments on my Mexico video. If you do have that idea, I just want to tell you that it's not true. The Roosevelt administration did not have any intentions to invade or attack Brazil at any time. Indeed, the U.S. went out of its way to cultivate Brazil's goodwill and cooperation. Not to mention that an American invasion of Brazil would have been a strategic disaster that would have taken literally millions of troops that could have been better used to, fight the U.S.'s actual enemies in the war, the Germans and Japanese. There were, however, theoretical plans to send U.S. troops to Brazil to fight Germans. But if and only if the Germans actually made this hop from North Africa to northeastern Brazil, and the objective wouldn't have been to conquer Brazil, but to defend it from Nazis. American planners, including Marshall, absolutely did not want to have to do this. And when these plans were made up in the fall of 1941, the U.S. didn't even have the troops to do it. It was just a theoretical war plan. And once Vargas concluded a deal in October 1941 for a $20 million loan from the U.S. to build the Volta Redonda steel plant, Brazil was basically already an ally of the United States. Vargas was cooperative, U.S. ships and planes were on the way, and in any event, the mustache now had a lot bigger things to worry about, since he'd gone and invaded the Soviet Union. Then this happened. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had the effect of clarifying and sharpening a lot of the relationships between the U.S. and other countries. Most of Latin America went along with the U.S. as numerous countries severed diplomatic relations with the Axis powers, and 9 of them actually declared war on Japan. Brazil didn't go that far, but it was moving in that direction. In January 1942, just a month or so after Pearl Harbor, an Inter-American Conference of Western Hemisphere countries met at Rio de Janeiro, a strategically chosen venue. There had already been a couple of these conferences. I mentioned the one in Havana in July 1940 in my Mexico video. Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State, attended for the U.S. and met personally with Vargas. The issue of whether the U.S. could actually station troops in Brazil was contingent on the fulfillment of promises of military hardware that had already been made to Brazilian leaders. There was also the diplomatic question of whether all the Latin American countries would break diplomatic relations with the Axis. They didn't. Argentina and Chile were holdouts. But on January 28, 1942, after the Rio Conference ended, Brazil formally severed diplomatic and commercial relations with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Because at one point he had hopes of swaying Brazil to his side, Hitler and the German Navy had tried to avoid incidents at sea involving Brazil. There were a few in the 1939-42 period, and also some incidents with the British intercepting Brazilian ships carrying German goods to Brazil or vice versa. But after Vargas severed diplomatic relations, the gloves were off, and it was open season on Brazilian ships so far as the U-boats were concerned. On February 16, 1942, a ship called the Lawarch was sunk out of Belém. 4 more Brazilian ships were sunk by the end of April. This was the height of what was called the Battle of the Atlantic, which Winston Churchill later identified as one of the most perilous phases of the war for the Allies. So German submarines were basically everywhere in the Atlantic. On May 16th, the German High Command decided that any ships from any South American country except Chile and Argentina would be attacked without warning. Vargas had already made one deal with the Roosevelt administration to receive Lend-Lease aid from the United States. That happened even before Brazil declared war. In early 1942, that original deal was doubled. Brazil would eventually receive $200 million in Lend-Lease aid. Vargas rewarded the Americans by allowing, quote, technicians, not yet American troops, to come to Brazil to help set up air patrol routes between the Caribbean, the Brazilian coast, and the west coast of Africa. Negotiations continued for what was essentially a military alliance between Brazil and the U.S. In the meantime, in retaliation for Germany's order to sink South American ships, Brazil tasked its air force to attack any U-boats it saw on sight, and in fact it did so even before the declaration of war. The mustache was incensed. I mean, how dare a country defend itself against Nazi aggression? In late May, Hitler ordered his navy to prepare a plan to send subs specifically to attack Brazilian ships off the South American coast. A little later, Hitler called off the plan, called Operation Brazil, out of fear that it might ultimately push Argentina and Chile, his only potential friends remaining in South America, into the war. The sources I consulted conflicted on whether Operation Brazil was uncancelled or by whom. One source said that Hitler changed his mind again and the attack was on no later than June 29th. Another source, which I trust more, seems to indicate that it wasn't actually uncancelled, but somehow, possibly by mistake, one German sub, the U-507, was ordered into Brazilian waters, departing France on July 4th, 1942. Once off the coast of Brazil, that submarine's commander, one Haro Schacht, may have taken it upon himself to cruise freely off the coast instead of targeting convoys, believed to be carrying U.S.-built Sherman tanks from Recife to Africa, which is what the U-boat command back in Germany wanted him to try for. Ironically, those tanks soon went into action at El Alamein in October 1942, and may have made the difference that gave British forces the victory there, ending German General Rommel's Africa Corps permanently. We're not sure who ordered it, but we definitely know what the U-507 did. On August 15, 1942, the Nazi submarine torpedoed the Brazilian ship SS Baipendi off the coast of Salvador, the state of Bahia. It happened while the crew was having a birthday party for one of the officers. This Google Maps photosphere is near the site of the sinking. Out of 305 people aboard, including 233 passengers, only 36 survived. The ship sank so fast that the radio man didn't even have time to send a distress signal. Here's another irony about this story. The Baipendi was one of the formerly German ships that Brazil had acquired as a result of World War I. In fact, the Baipendi and the sub that sank her, the U-507, had been built in the very same shipyard. Adding even more horror to the event, after the Baipendi went down, the U-507 sank another ship in the area, the Araraquara, to which survivors of the Baipendi were trying to row in their leaking lifeboat. That disaster killed 131 people. 4 more Brazilian ships were sunk within the same week. The people of Brazil were outraged. Brazilian ships had been torpedoed before, and Brazilian lives lost to U-boats, but never before actually in Brazil's territorial waters, and the loss of life had never attained this scale before. At first, Vargas, who was recovering from severe injuries sustained in a car crash back in May, seemed stunned. But as cabinet and military meetings played out and mass demonstrations broke out into the streets, the course of action he had to take was obvious. In Fortaleza, an angry mob broke into stores owned by Germans and Italians and set them on fire. More stores and offices were ransacked in Belém. In Manaus, rioters beat up and badly injured people thought to be German or Italian citizens. It was very clear where public opinion was. On August 22, 1942, Getúlio Vargas issued a declaration of war on Germany and Italy. At an address on Brazil's Independence Day, September 7th, Vargas said, quote, "You asked by every form of expression of the popular will that the government should declare war on the aggressors, and this was done." End quote. Brazil had effectively been at war for some time before August 1942, but now it was officially a participant in World War II and a close ally of the United States. How the war played out is detailed in the next chapter. This old closed-down airfield, located in Natal, Brazil, was called Parnamirim Air Base during the World War II era. It later became a civilian airport and ceased operations in 2014. But in January 1943, two presidents, Getúlio Vargas of Brazil and Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States, met here and toured the airbase as part of FDR's surprise conference with his new ally. Roosevelt was on his way back from the Casablanca Conference. This was not the first time the two leaders met. FDR encountered Vargas in Rio de Janeiro in 1936, and they got along personally quite well. They spoke French to one another, and they had a common emotional bond. Roosevelt famously contracted polio in 1921 at age 39. Vargas's son, who studied at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, also got polio. Vargas also sent FDR stamps for his collection. Whatever their personal rapport, both presidents had agendas at this meeting. FDR, of course, wanted Brazil's continued cooperation with bases and patrolling the South Atlantic via sea and air, which they were already doing. He already had this in the bag before he went to Natal. He seems to have been thinking more of the post-war. He wanted Brazil's participation in the proposed United Nations. Vargas was of course agreeable, but he pressed his usual price: armaments, equipment, and investment from the United States. By the time Roosevelt and Vargas met, the idea of a Brazilian expeditionary force, troops from Brazil actually on the ground fighting on the battlefield, was already in the wind. Unlike Mexico, whose leaders came to the idea of direct participation pretty late and somewhat reluctantly, Brazil wanted to get into the fight directly. Even some of the senior officers who were seen as pro-German seemed to want this. On New Year's Eve, 1942, Vargas had attended a luncheon of military officers where he told them that Brazil should be prepared to do more for the war effort than simply sending raw materials and acting as a way station for American and other Allied troops on their way to various places, mainly Africa. The ultimate goal, of course, was modernization of the army. If Brazil could get the United States to foot the bill for that, even to the point of supplying weapons for Brazilian troops, it was worth it. While the preparations for ground troops and various economic wartime measures were taking shape, Brazil had the unenviable job of patrolling its very long coast to defend against German subs. They had already been doing this in cooperation with the United States Navy, even before the declaration of war. By 1942, the old dreadnoughts that had been the prize of Brazil's fleet in the World War I era, the São Paulo and the Minas Gerais, were still around, but very obsolete and good only for coastal defense. Believe it or not, Brazil had 4 submarines, pretty modern and advanced for the time. But it's not like they were going around out there hunting German subs. They were used mostly for training anti-submarine air and ship forces. The US and Brazilian navies and air forces set up an elaborate chain of coastal defense stations and convoy systems to escort ships along the Brazilian coast. It wasn't completely effective. The Nazis continued to sink Brazilian ships throughout 1942 and 1943. A major problem was that ships of officially neutral but Nazi-friendly countries, especially Spain and Argentina, would radio German U-boats about the locations of Brazilian ships they happened to spot. or else broadcast phony distress signals so as to draw away U.S. and Brazilian escort craft and leave ships sitting ducks for attacks by submarines. They could never really solve this problem. Brazil did what it could to step up its anti-submarine warfare efforts. In October 1943, the Brazilian Navy even established a special school to teach anti-submarine tactics. The official record was pretty commendable. During the war, Brazilian Navy ships escorted over 3,100 Allied merchant ships, losing only 3 in the process. But it came at a cost. One account of official numbers lists 492 Brazilian Navy personnel killed in the war, plus 470 merchant mariners and 502 civilian passengers who died on various ships attacked by German U-boats. By the end of 1943, preparations were well underway for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. The training, equipping, and outfitting of Brazilian troops was done in close cooperation with the U.S. Army. There were some problems. Because a lot of Brazilians were mustered into the army from the rural areas where healthcare was considerably more primitive than it was in the United States, a lot of potential recruits were eliminated for health reasons. Yes, Brazil had a draft in World War II, but it wasn't too efficient. In one part of the country, the evasion rate was almost 49%. Brazilian army leaders originally said they'd only take men more than 5 foot 9 inches in height, 1.75 meters, because, in the words of one army report, they wanted to, quote, show the world what big husky people the Brazilians are. They had to sort of fudge this requirement, as you might imagine. A lot of recruits were rejected for having bad teeth, but that was true also in the U.S. armed forces. A lot of people had bad teeth in the early 40s. But in mid-December 1943, U.S. Secretary of War Henry Stimson made an official announcement that a Brazilian expeditionary force was in the works. By this time, the fighting was over in North Africa, the most logical place for Brazilian troops to fight. But the war was raging now in Italy, so military leaders decided that's where they should go. On June 30th, 1944, the first wave of the FEB boarded the American transport USS General W.A. Mann in Rio de Janeiro, bound for Naples, Italy. Their commander was Field Marshal João Bautista Mascarenhas de Moraes. He had fought in a number of conflicts we've talked about, such as the revolt at Fort Copacabana in 1922 and the Constitutionalist Revolution 10 years later. Although briefly jailed when Vargas came to power, Mascarenhas de Moraes ultimately supported the Estado Novo government. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, called FEB after its name in Portuguese, was known as the Smoking Cobras. This is the part of the story of Brazil in World War II that gets most of the attention. Eventually, the Brazilians were put into the U.S. Army's 4 Corps, that's Roman numeral 4IV, under the command of General Willis D. Crittenberger, who is so much of a stereotypical World War II guy that he's a dead ringer for Dean Jagger as General Waverly in the famous 1950s Christmas movie White Christmas. Which is fitting because that film depicts a U.S. Army Corps fighting in Italy in late 1944, exactly the time and place that the Smoking Cobras were there. Sadly, the movie doesn't depict any Brazilians, at least not that I can see. In any event, Brazilians fought in numerous engagements in Italy: Massa Rossa, Montesi, Marano sul Parano, and especially Monte Castello, which is probably the most famous battle they were involved in. The Brazilians made 4 major assaults on an entrenched German position at Monte Castello, suffering heavy casualties. The 4th assault was the charm. They eventually captured it on February 21st, 1945. According to one report, a German officer told a captured Brazilian lieutenant after one of the unsuccessful assaults, quote, "Frankly, you Brazilians are either crazy or very brave. I never saw anyone advance against machine guns and well-defended positions with such disregard for life. You are devils," end quote. The Brazilian Air Force also got in on the action. The 1st Brazilian Fighter Squadron flew a total of 445 missions, particularly in the campaign around the Po River Valley in Italy. The squadron's record was impressive. By some analytics, the Brazilian Air Force destroyed a significantly greater percentage of its targets than other Allied air forces did. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force had a total strength of 25,900 men. Officially, there were 948 men killed in action. Brazil was the only Latin American country to send ground troops into combat in World War II. Mexico's contribution was a fighter squadron in the Pacific Theater. On the whole, the war went pretty well for Brazil. It would be very hard to argue that Brazil's contribution made the difference between Allied victory and defeat. No one says that. But similarly, no one can say that Brazil's contribution was insignificant or unnecessary. It was highly necessary to achieve the political and particularly economic goals of Brazil's leaders, principally Getúlio Vargas. And it was thought extremely valuable to the United States. The U.S. shoveled money and supplies to Brazil during the war. In fact, 70% of American Lend-Lease aid sent to Latin America was given to Brazil. World War II, however, proved to be the last gasp of the Vargas regime. The story of how it ended and what happened next is in the next chapter. On July 4th, 1945, the Brazilian Navy cruiser Bahia was conducting anti-aircraft exercises way out in the middle of the Atlantic, on the equator, between Brazil and the African coast. Brazil had technically declared war on Japan on June 6th, and U.S. military planners thought the Brazilian Navy could help as rescue craft for transport planes that might run into trouble over the Atlantic while ferrying American troops from Europe to the Pacific. That's what the Bahia was doing out there. A gunner aboard the Bahia, firing at a target kite, accidentally hit a rack of depth charges on the back of the ship. They blew up and the Bahia went down, killing more than half of its crew of over 300 sailors. This tragic accident cast a pall over Brazil's otherwise triumphant exit from the global conflict. Incidentally, why didn't Brazil declare war on Japan earlier? The answer is a bit murky. Historians haven't found a lot of clear indicators. It may have had to do with a fear of antagonizing the substantial number of Japanese-born and Japanese-descended Brazilians in the country. Or Vargas, seeing the imminent end of American Lend-Lease from the war in Europe, might have wanted to keep jumping on the gravy train for a little longer. In any event, Brazil took no substantive part in the Pacific War, which in any event was totally over within a little more than 3 months after the declaration. Brazil also declined to participate in occupation duties in post-war Europe. The reasons for this are also a bit unclear. American General Mark Clark apparently envisioned assigning the FEB to join the occupation of Austria, but several Brazilian officers argued, both to U.S. commanders and to the Vargas government, that Brazilian troops shouldn't get involved and should instead hightail it back home as quickly as possible. Certain officers did distrust the new relationship with the United States and feared that Americans would turn on them when the war was over. But in any event, Brazil's troops returned home fairly quickly, and then before the end of 1945, there was a sudden change of government. This was in the wind even before the end of the war. In October 1943, 90 prominent citizens of Minas Gerais published a manifesto calling for the abolition of the dictatorship and a return to democracy. Vargas predictably denounced the manifesto as unpatriotic and damaging to the war effort. Theoretically, he was supposed to stand for election that year, 1943, but the fact of the war gave him a convenient excuse to cancel the election, with the promise that there would be an election once the war was over. Even Vargas's own advisors were telling him that he was going to have to go once peace was restored. Furthermore, with the defeat of the fascist powers, the worldwide trend seemed to be headed toward democracy, in a marked reversal from the tenor of the times when Vargas took over. Vargas made some noises that indicated he was thinking of it. When talking circumspectly about the future election, this is while the war was still going on, he hinted that he was ineligible and not going to run. But he didn't come out and say it explicitly. 2 military men, Eduardo Gomes and General Dutra, announced their candidacies. Dutra officially had the blessing of Vargas. Just a note, political parties in this period weren't as important in Brazil as in other countries. Often they were temporary, forming ahead of an election and dissolving or merging into another party after it. In May 1945, Vargas announced that the new elections would be held on December 2nd. Just as everyone thought, the main contest would be between Gomes and Dutra. One of the new parties that sprang up, called the Brazilian Labor Party, suddenly named Vargas as its honorary president. And a group called the Queremistas suddenly appeared in the streets of Rio in early October. They got their name because they stomped around with banners reading Queremos Getulio. We want Getulio, meaning Vargas. These Vargas superfans weren't campaigning for him. Their explicit demand was that the presidential election be canceled so Vargas could remain in power indefinitely. This alarmed a lot of people, including the military, who, despite having put Vargas in power back in 1930, now generally thought it was time for him to leave. The dictator wasn't doing himself any favors, but two factors sealed his fate. One was that he started to relax the political repression against leftists and communists that had been put in place in 1935. Remember Luis Carlos Prestes, the guy who commanded the column in the revolt in the 1920s? Well, he had become a communist and was even thrown in jail, but Vargas let him out in April 1945, just as the war in Europe was winding up. Vargas also opened diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, which at this time was still a member of the Allies. Nevertheless, quite predictably, these actions started to spook the United States, which was a little wary of continuing to support Vargas. The second thing that happened was the political rise of Juan Perón, the army officer in Argentina. The sudden labor demonstration in Buenos Aires on October 17, 1945, which is the genesis of the Argentinian holiday called Loyalty Day, resulted in the release of Perón from prison and eventually propelled him into the presidency of Argentina. The Brazilian military feared that this event would embolden Vargas to try something similar and seize power in Brazil. Vargas had already removed the chief of police of the federal district and replaced him with his own brother. A group of generals decided they couldn't wait for December 2nd, so they had to act immediately to take Vargas out. Chief among them, incredibly, was Pedro de Gois Monteiro, the general who had helped put Vargas in power back in 1930. On October 29, 1945, a bunch of troops surrounded the presidential palace. Tanks, which Brazil had gotten from the U.S. as Lend-Lease supplies during the war, briefly appeared in the streets of Rio. Surprisingly, though, the coup of October 1945 was pretty quick and bloodless. With his main generals against him, Vargas realized that resistance was futile. Now, that's not just a Star Trek reference. The phrase resistance is futile actually appears in one of the books I used to research this video in describing the coup. Vargas resigned as president. The army implored the president of Brazil's Supreme Federal Court, José Linhares, to assume the office of president temporarily, which he did. The coup of October 1945 was extraordinary in Latin American and world history because it represents a very rare example of the military deposing a head of state, not to take power themselves, but to safeguard a democratic election and a peaceful transfer of power. This doesn't happen in history very often. It happened in Brazil. The election went forward as planned on December 2nd, 1945. This was pretty much the first truly fair and honest election Brazil ever had on the federal level. Voter participation was also much broader in this election than in any one previously. Rico Dutra won with 55.39% to Eduardo Gomes' 34.74%. There was also a third-party candidate, Iedu Fusa, who was not a communist himself, but supported by the Brazilian Communist Party. He won 9.71%. Dutra was inaugurated the 16th president of Brazil on January 31st, 1946. The Vargas dictatorship was over, and so was the Estado Novo regime that he'd established in 1937. Indeed, the coup of October 1945 and the subsequent election of Dutra marks the beginning of what Brazilians call the Fourth Republic. World War II was over. A new era of world history, the Cold War era, was about to begin. The great changes that occurred in Brazil between the beginning of World War I and the end of World War II were sweeping and consequential. Brazil in 1946 was the same country it had been in 1910. The same borders, the same people, the same culture, same traditions, but in many ways it was an entirely different country at the same time. The world wars had a lot to do with that transformation, and that's why this period of Brazil's history is especially important. Here's what happened to some of the major players in our story, and Brazil in general, in the years after the World Wars era. Brazil entered the Fourth Republic period with the beginning of Dutra's presidency in 1946. For the first time since the overthrow of the empire, Brazilian politics became defined in large measure by political parties with particular ideological orientations. The Social Democratic Party, the Brazilian Labor Party, and the National Democratic Union were the most important of these. The struggle for labor rights, racial and ethnic equality, modernization and industrialization, and social justice all continued throughout this period, and a succession of tumultuous presidencies. The reasons for the military coup in March 1964 are extremely complicated, and I can't begin to do them justice here. There is a continuity with the World Wars era. In the early 1960s, Brazil's military was outmoded, underfunded, and in political and administrative crisis. There was also a sense, especially during the presidency of João Goulart, that the state was going too far in terms of social and labor reforms. Both the military takeover that brought Vargas to power in 1930 and the intervention that took him out in 1945 were examples of the military stepping in to correct a wayward political system that they believed was becoming dysfunctional. Most of the major plotters of the 1964 coup had served in World War II, and some had been trained in the United States as part of the American aid and cooperation programs. Unfortunately, the results of the 1964 coup were disastrous. Brazil entered 2 decades of darkness, an authoritarian regime marked by torture, killings, political repression, and censorship. Naturally, the United States supported this regime because it was anti-communist. It finally fell in 1985, but plenty of damage had been done. The military dictatorship could not have happened at all if Vargas's Estado Novo hadn't paved the way. Getúlio Vargas had ruled Brazil for 15 years, between 1930 and 1945. You might think he was finished when the coup of December 1945 took him out. You'd be wrong. His retirement was short-lived. In 1950, he returned to politics and leveraged a delicate political coalition to return to power via the ballot box rather than military force, though he just barely won and did not get a majority of the vote. Vargas's second presidency was almost as tumultuous as his first. In August 1954, a Brazilian Air Force officer named Rubens Vaz was shot and killed in a political hit intended to take out Carlos Lacerda, a journalist and politician fiercely opposed to Vargas. An investigation into the murder implicated the president's own head of security and caused a political crisis he couldn't manage, particularly with the military, who had once again turned on him. This is the Catete Palace in Rio de Janeiro, the former residence of the presidents of Brazil. On August 24, 1954, in a third-floor bedroom of this building, Getúlio Vargas, dressed in his pajamas, held the barrel of a gun to his chest and pulled the trigger. His death shocked the nation. Riots erupted in Rio and Porto Alegre. Interpretations of the event, both by Brazilians at the time and by historians subsequently, are highly contradictory. Some argue his suicide may have postponed the return of military rule by a decade. In any event, Vargas remains a controversial figure with a complicated legacy. Pedro Aurelio de Góes Monteiro, the general who helped Vargas come to power and who served as chief of staff of the army during World War II and minister of war after it, left government briefly, but was then elected senator from the state of Alagoas, where his family was powerful, in 1947. He declined the opportunity to be Vargas's running mate in 1950, but served again as Vargas's military chief of staff in the early 1950s. He died in 1956. Luiz Carlos Prestes, the former tenente who led the Prestes column in the 1920s and later turned to communism, enjoyed a political revival in the brief stretch of time that Vargas tried to liberalize his regime at the end of World War II. But by 1947, he was an enemy of the state again and carried on his political activities in exile. The Brazilian Communist Party split in the early 60s into a pro-Moscow and a pro-Beijing faction. Prestes led the pro-Soviet faction. In 1970, he moved to Moscow and lived there for a time, returning to Brazil in 1979 during the military government's brief amnesty. Prestes lived to see the military regime fall. He died in Brasilia in 1990, age 92. João Bautista Mascarenhas de Moraes, field commander of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, received numerous awards and honors after his return from the European theater. He served as Chief of Staff of the Army during Vargas's second presidency. He wrote his memoirs of the war years, lived out his life, and died in Rio de Janeiro in 1968. The steel plant at Volta Redonda, which was one of the crowning goals of Vargas in his World War II diplomacy, opened its doors in 1946, the first major steel mill in South America. CSN, the state-owned steel company that ran the plant, became the largest steel-producing company in Latin America. It still exists, as does the Volta Redonda plant, though it was privatized in 1993. This, a major legacy of Brazil's participation in World War II, helped power Brazil's rise as a modern industrialized economy. The U-507, the German submarine whose torpedo attacks in 1942, particularly on the Baipendi, finally brought Brazil into the war, had an especially rich poetic justice ending. In the first days of 1943, the ship's commander, Haro Schacht, received word via radio that the German High Command had awarded him the Knight's Cross. On January 13th, 1943, the U-507 was spotted by a Catalina PBY patrol craft flying from a base at Fortaleza, Brazil, that had been established through the cooperation between the Brazilian and U.S. militaries. The plane scored several direct hits and sank the U-507. There were no survivors. Given the U-507's role in Brazil's decision to declare war, this victory was particularly sweet and sent a strong message to the Axis powers. Don't screw with Brazil. Brazil's experience in the world wars was pivotal. The military and political developments between 1914 and 1945 saw Brazil's emergence as a modern nation, with a fragile democracy that was often under threat or totally obscured by dictatorship, both during that period and after it. The events of the World Wars era set the stage for Brazil's later history in the 20th and 21st centuries, including the terrible years of its military rule and the story, not always a linear one, of its return to democratic traditions. That story has a lot of facets, which we don't have time to go into today. But I hope this video has given you a sense of why Brazil's history in this period matters. It's a lot more than just the smoking cobras. You know that now. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, share it, give it a thumbs up, do all the stuff you normally do for a video you like. There's a members section on my YouTube channel, which you can join for $5 a month. There you'll find an ad-free version of this video with significant additional material. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the description. As usual, I want to say that no part of this video, including the research or writing of the script, was done with AI. My crime novel that came out in December 2024, The Gangster Crown, is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. I also teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com, and you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get the columns delivered directly to your email. On that blog, at the paid tier, I write articles that go behind the scenes of the making of these videos and my thoughts on them, if you're interested. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.
Bate a chuva lá fora e me faz lembrar alguém que partiu em silêncio, noite de chuva também. Aqui dentro eu chorando e a chuva caindo no meu coração. Na estrada a garoa triste gemendo, batendo no chão. Bate a chuva lá fora e me faz lembrar alguém que partiu em silêncio, noite de chuva também. Morre a noite na serra e o dia me encontra com o violão. É a minha esperança que morre levando mais uma ilusão.
E é do bambu, lele bambu, é do bambu, lalá. E é do bambu.
Bate a chuva lá fora e me faz lembrar alguém que partiu em silêncio, noite de chuva também.